We're talking about pork. We're talking about the vertical integration production model of pork. We're talking about environmental concerns. We're talking about African swine fever. We're talking about profitability in meat production, all those topics and more. I've got pork people coming up in this edition of the Business of Agriculture. Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, and the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field. Then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. We're talking pork. I've got two pork experts on. I've got Adam Krause. He is a contract grower of pork in the state of South Dakota. He also is on the board of the South Dakota Pork Producers Council. He's their president. And I've got Glenn Muller. He is the executive director of South Dakota Pork Producers Council. I'm going to be speaking in South Dakota in Sioux Falls for their annual convention in January. That's right, January. The date on the calendar is January 11th, Thursday at 10 a.m. I'm going to be taking the stage. And I said, you know what? I haven't talked about pork at the production level. I've got a whole bunch of questions, and I know my listeners do too, about some of these topics. Why don't you come on and we'll have an episode digging into a big old plate full of pork. Okay, first off, guys, let's hit right to the money. I just was hearing, listening to like rural radio, the business side of it, and they said, here we are. We haven't seen margins this poor since the 1990s. There's just no money right now in pork. Demand is stagnant to down a little, and then supply is heavy, I think are the reasons. If you say anything to anybody that knows their ag history and they start referencing pork in the late 90s, hogs went to like 7 cents a pound, and that's what washed out a bunch of independent producers. So let's talk about money before we get into all the other stuff. Is it that bad?
It is really critical right now because we talk about sustainability, and the number one sustainability factor in an operation is profitability. And there's very narrow margins in the hog industry. The industry has grown substantially, particularly in South Dakota, but in conjunction with that, we've lost some of our export markets due to foreign trade issues and policies, and so that's been very negative to us. We've been fortunate to export about 26% of the product we produce in the United States, but it's very volatile, and that's concerning as well as we expand the industry.
Okay, so thank you, Glenn. So those are some quick, good numbers. 26% of the pork right now being produced in the United States of America gets exported. That's a good thing, considering if my numbers are right, going back to say 25 years ago, late 90s, we didn't really export any. So if we've grown our exports to the point where we went from a non-exporting pork country to about more than 1/4 of what we produce goes overseas, how are our margins still so poor? Is it just because we've produced like crazy?
Yeah, we've expanded the industry. We've got a lot of assets in the United States and in South Dakota. You know, we got a cheap corn basis. Our basis is very, very wide, so we need to find a use for our corn. We export corn, we export soybeans, both of which are the major ingredients in the diet of the hog industry. So we have expanded based on that need to help improve the basis level on corn and soybeans in the area. We have not done as well in increasing demand. Our per capita consumption has been fairly stable. We've seen some movement. Bacon is very popular, but we're having problems moving the loin and the other whole cuts.
All right. So you just said a lot there. Adam, I want to cut to you. The money on pork, when I hear these reports, it used to be then going back again to the 1998, let's say, if I was having to sell fat hogs at 7 cents a pound, that's a real number. By the way, make sure you correct me here if I'm wrong, Glenn. You're the one that's more historically tied into pork. But I think I remember 7 cents a pound, which cost of production was what, 40, back then. You couldn't fire up the truck to haul the hogs to market, let alone, make a nickel on that, make any money on that. Then we came into the vertical integration thing where you get paid. So if you're a contract grower and you produce pigs, you do it now per pig per space. So while it might matter to someone that owns all those hogs, for you as a contract grower, you get paid to produce hogs for someone above you. Do you care about pork profitability?
Yes, I do. And we actually had discussions about that. We had discussions very real discussions during COVID and hypothetical discussions of African swine fever. And as a lot of contract growers in throughout the United States, that's a very real possibility that your contract could be terminated by quote unquote an act of God. A lot of those contracts have that clause within them. And I mean, if the person writing your checks goes under because hogs are no longer profitable, guess what? I'm probably not going to make my barn payment that month.
Yeah,
so
wait, real quickly. This is one of the arguments against contract growing, and we're going to get into that a little bit later on. Act of God means a tornado wipes out their processing facility. Them having a bad business doesn't constitute act of God. Help me out there.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Act of God, I would say.
Although, by the way, if they go broke, Adam, by the way, if it's an act of God or not, if they're broke and they're supposed to pay you and they ain't got no money, you're probably screwed, whether it's an act of God or just an act of business failure, no matter what, right?
That's fair. I guess I was speaking of act of God. They were talking with COVID-19 and the possibility of African swine fever hitting our shores. But that being said, that's still a very real concern of if the company that you are working for has a situation and is no longer able to pay you. I mean, you're in a very real place of, okay, how do I make my barn payment and pay my debts and utilities the next month? You either have to go find someone really, really quick, or you're going to need a little bit of cash on hand to be able to tread water in that time period.
Glenn, you've been in the industry for, I'm guessing, your whole career. This whole history that we talk about here, it has brought up some criticism. You hear the old timers. Well, it ain't like the old days when a guy could actually raise his own hogs and maybe hit a home run. Now you're just working for somebody else. And on the flip side, well, there's a lot of people that not only didn't hit home runs, they had to liquidate their assets and go and get a job at a factory in town because it didn't work for them. I don't see a problem with the vertical integration system where large entities essentially create a contract and by the way, for the person listening to this that has no idea what I'm talking about, in the old days, you raised your pigs, you took them to town and sold them, and you were an independent producer. After the washout of the late 1990s, help me out, Glenn, we went to more of a vertical integration contract grower system. Would you explain how that generally works? I know that every contract's a little different, but in general, to the person that's completely, the cranberry grower from Cape Cod that's listening to this episode.
Well, you're exactly right. Back in the 1998s, or when we had a lot of the depression in the hog market, we had a lot of small farms that still had hogs on their farm, diversified operations. And a lot of those decided at that time that they could no longer support the hog enterprise and got out of it. So in order to produce more hogs, we vertically integrated. We got larger facilities. We adapted new technology in the barns. And so the industry has changed. And so rather than a large number of producers with a few hogs, we now have fewer producers, but we're still producing the same amount or a few more hogs. And it's no different than any other business. If you look at the small towns over time, they all had a family pharmacy and family operation and maybe no Walmart access. Today we have Walmart. We look for cheap products. We look for cheap food supply. And so the margins are very narrow. So that's why we have to have a large volume. You can't support a family operation on 50 sows any longer like you could back in 98 or in the 80s.
Yeah, right. Well, and one could quibble that you couldn't do it in the 1980s anyway, because look at the farm crisis in the 1980s. By the way, I'm very realistic about this. Anybody that's been listening to my show for the last 316 episodes or 320 episodes knows the good old days and the rose-colored lenses. I lived through the 80s, and anybody was telling me the good old days was somehow 40 years ago in agriculture, I'll call bullshit on that every day of the week. I lived through it, and we barely made it, and many people did not. So the way the system works is just in a nutshell. If you're completely removed from this, let's say you grow almonds in California, you're like, I wonder what this hog thing's all about back there in the Midwest. An integrator, it might have their own processing facility. They generally own the sows. The piglets come off the sows. They might go to another grower to take them to a certain weight. And then at a certain weight, 40 pounds, probably something like that, Adam?
Roughly 50 to 60.
Okay, roughly 50 to 60 pounds. Then those piglets come to your barn. You are paid to produce them. You get bonuses based on efficiencies or survivability, meaning if you don't have some problem, if you don't have any death loss, and then those pigs go away. You don't pay for the feed. You don't pay for the pigs. You do pay for the building. The building then is paid for by you, but it's through a contract. It's based on a contract you get to be a grower for them. So it's almost like I own a warehouse that other people use. It's that kind of a situation, but you do the work. Am I right on how the system works?
Yeah, very similar. I think it depends on the contract. If you're talking bonuses and numbers and scheduling and things like that, it depends who you're feeding for. And a lot of times it just comes down to what does your contract say, but also communication with your what a lot of people call them territory managers or team members or schedulers. It's just the more communication we can have, the better off I think everybody is.
So the pigs go through your barn and they go get processed. A lot of people that don't understand, that listen to my show, do understand when the whole pandemic was shutting down meat processing plants. And I said, all these hogs are going to end up getting destroyed and buried. And my friends even said, I understand. Why can't they just wait? I said, well, you don't seem to understand that pig goes out of that barn and there's another that comes right behind it. That's how tight our supply chain is. So Glenn, speak to that a little bit about, because people didn't understand the whole COVID thing. When I produced a video right after I eat my Easter ham and I said, 2 plants just shut down. We're going to end up having meat problems. We're going to have some shortages and we're going to end up having a bunch of hogs that end up going out and getting euthanized and buried. And people didn't understand that. And I said, why can't they just hold them? I said, okay, why don't you take a truckload and we'll put them in your condo? Huh? I said, well, where do you think we're going to hold these things? Go ahead and speak to that real quickly.
Well, yeah, the industry has changed how we raise hogs because back in the early days, and let's go back in 98 and forget about 1980s, like you say, but at that time, the producer was primarily raising the hogs entirely from birth to market on his own operation on his own farm. Today, the pigs are farrowed at one site. Their pigs are born at one site. They're raised up to anywhere from 13 pounds. Some pigs are moved at 13 pounds into a different barn. In Adam's case, they're about a little heavier than that, I believe. But they come in and they're raised till they're 50 pounds, which is called a nursery operation. And from that point, they're moved again to a finishing barn from 50 pounds up to the market weight, which will be anywhere from 275 to 290. And so there's 3 segments of the industry basically anymore. And so that's what's changed a lot. And it's allowed producers to be specialists within their area. They don't have to know about everything within the hog industry, but you can train people to be specialists in raising a baby pig and getting them to nurse and getting them up to weaning weight. Train people to take that baby pig and teaching him, as in Adam's case, teaching him how to eat from a feeder, drink from a nipple and water and that type of thing, and get him up to 50 pounds and then move him to the next facility where they take him the rest of the way and finish him out. So that's been a change in the industry of how we structure and how we raise our pigs as well.
Yeah. And so the thing when the meat processing facilities were being shut down because of COVID illnesses and whatnot, when I explained that this means a bunch of hogs are going to never make it to market, and then my friends I had people that said, explain this to me. And I said, there's nowhere for them to go. They're already that pipeline is so tight that if there's no place for them to go right now, for a few days we can hold off, maybe a week and a half, but by at some point there's another pig right behind it that needs that trough space. And that one was supposed to have already been butchered. It's got nowhere to go. And people didn't get that. And like I said, they kept asking, why can't the farmer just hold them? I said, where would you put thousands and thousands of pigs other than the facility that you already have, which is at capacity? Like let them in your yard. You go out and try and put up a bunch of fence. People did not get that.
Yeah, as Adam already mentioned, scheduling. In most of these cases, the variation from one stage to another, in other words, the time that the nursery is emptied, in Adam's case, until he gets the next pigs, ideally would be like 3 days, so that the producer can come in, entirely disinfect the barn to eliminate any disease organisms that may have been in the barn from the previous group, get it dried out and get it disinfected so that they could bring in the next set of pigs, and it's usually 3 or 4 days. Right, Adam?
Yep, right in there. Yep.
That, by the way, 3 to 4 days is about much wiggle we have, and that's the point. If the meat processing facilities close more than 3 or 4 days, now we're probably having to get rid. By the way, we did a much better job during that whole COVID time. We didn't euthanize and have to bury as many pigs as you might have thought, because we did flex and adjust and finagle as best we could. Speaking of then the business model and go back to the money, I got a real important question. Adam, first off for you, are you happy with your arrangement? The people that criticize this new model of contractual production of the pig, it seems to work. In general, pork's affordable. In general, pork is obviously very healthy. There's not a bunch of disease problems, and you're in business, and so it must work.
Yeah, absolutely. I was able to come home from college and build my nursery barn and become a contract grower. Wasn't sure I honestly don't know if I would have been able to do that, at least not right away. If I didn't have that opportunity. It was just a timing thing. Another producer was going to look elsewhere to grow for somewhere else. So I was able to slide in and fill that void within the system I feed for. So it's been a great opportunity. You asked if I'm happy. It depends on the day sometimes, but no, I think a lot of contract growers are pretty happy with how they're being compensated and the amount of less risk it is. I don't have to worry about markets. I don't have to worry about feed fluctuations necessarily. I mean, I do, because I also farm row crops with my father, but that being said, it's just I have my utilities I need to pay for. I have my bank payment to my barn, and I get a yardage check once a month. So it's a lot. It's really cuts in on the simplicity.
I think that, Glenn, when you hear people that have criticized the contract grower situation, it's not much different. A young guy that wanted to be in farming, or a young guy, a gal, whatever, in the old days, come back to the farm. There's not enough revenue off of the farm. Go and get a job in town and then farm on the side. This is that thing. This is that job in town that it's got a guarantee. There's also the manure, and that's a value. In fact, my buddy Todd Thurman says that we might be this year and maybe forever in a point where the manure is worth more than the profit margin on the pig. So speak to that, both of you. Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. The manure has extremely high value because of the fact that it's a natural nutrient put back into the soil. It completes the whole ecological cycle that we use that manure, put it back on the ground, raise the crop, put the crop back into the pig. And so it has extreme value, and particularly with the increased cost of fertilizer over the course of time, that fertilizer has become extremely expensive. So therefore the manure value has increased, and Adam could speak to that probably better from their farming operation, how they utilize the manure.
Absolutely. Maybe not so much this past spring, but last year, a full calendar year away, fall time, I mean, we saw urea, NP, and K through the roof. So that really made manure profitability look really well. But another thing we have to worry about too is people, when they talk about expansions or building a new barn or renovations, ever since COVID, building supplies have exploded. It is incredible. And that's even if you get a contractor scheduled to do your job. So building my barn, I got really immersed by my father and a few other business people in the ag industry that I highly respect to this day. And we talk about cash flow a lot and how that cash flow works. I mean, we talk about a young kid like me at the time wanting to go buy a piece of ground. I don't know somebody told me it didn't cash flow in the 80s and it still doesn't cash flow today. But golly, we keep raising our hands. It's interesting. But when we talk about cash flow of a barn, they said 2014, 2016, you could cash flow a finisher barn. Now you can't cash flow a finisher barn unless you include the manure as part of your cash flow.
Yeah, and the manure used to be
really
the manure was like a fringe benefit. It was like a freebie on top. It was and it was good.
Exactly.
All right, so then that begs the question about money, and I know we talked a lot about money, but it all goes back to the whole thing. We talked about manure, we talked about the grower system, et cetera. We haven't talked about disease yet. We're going to get to that. Before we do, I want to ask you, dear farmer, if you are on this podcast and you have questions. How do you get your questions answered? My buddy Rob Syke did some research. He's the inventor of AgVisor Pro. I'm wearing their hat right now. It's an app you can put on your phone. He found out that 19% of a farmer's time is trying to get information. And, we do live in an information society. So why is information so hard to come by? It's not like you have to go to the library and, look it up in a book in the card catalog. You can use your phone, but you can use your phone more efficiently. You can do that by putting the app AgVisor Pro on your phone, AgVisor Pro. There's a whole bunch of people on there that know answers to questions that you may have. Rather than going on Twitter and typing in for the know-it-all dumbasses to ridicule you, find people that actually can answer your questions and do it so efficiently. It'll save you time and it'll save you money. It'll shorten your time and your distance to the answers you need to become profitable. AgVisor Pro. Put it on your phone. All right. Begs the question, Glenn, you've been around this business. If right now the manure is worth money and nothing cash flows, it struggles to cash flow. And we hear that even the vertical integrators are really struggling for profitability. Why are we still expanding? Or are we?
Well, I think it's leveled off at this point. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've seen growth of the industry in South Dakota at about 8% a year. This last year, and our contractors were booked solid for a year out before you could get a new building built because of the demand on putting up new buildings. Today, that's come to a stop. Negative margins, the lending institutions looked at, as Adam said, the cash flow aspect, and so they could cash flow a barn, and they were willing to lend the money. Today, it's if you can't utilize the manure, as Adam said, you're not going to cash flow on a barn. So it's slowed down the expansion phase right now. So I don't see any major expansion. There's still some new barns going up, but they're replacing some aged barns, and there's some demolition going on of some aged barns. So right now, I think we're stable, and that's kind of where we are today.
All right, this is a question. I keep up a lot with this kind of stuff. I pull articles from the non-ag media. You said 26% of our pork is getting exported. Again, going back 20, 30 years ago, we were at one point 20 or 30 years ago, we were an importer of pork. And so now we're a net exporter of pork. Can exports grow anymore? I mean, you got Brazil coming on, you got the European Union, you got troubles with China. Is it reasonable to think that 26% is about as good as we're going to get of getting rid of our pork?
No, I think we have some opportunities yet. The sad part is that sometimes you have to play off of somebody else's hardship, and the rest of the world is really impacted by ASF right now. China in particular, it's hard to get any statistics out of there that we really feel confident with, but China has a major demand for pork. Pork is the number one protein around the world, and that's primarily because of China. But the volatility of depending on exports based on policy and based on health of those herds in the other countries really makes it volatile for the U.S. producer to depend on that market. So we're very conscientious that we need to make sure that we maintain those markets, expand into new market areas, and develop our export markets.
Okay. By the way, for the person that's not in the industry, ASF means African swine fever, and we've been dealing with it globally. It almost was before the COVID thing, right? It's like 4 years now we've had, and even before that. So, Adam, give me a little background. What's ASF do, and why is it bad for pigs?
Sure. African swine fever is a highly contagious, but also high mortality disease that can wipe out a lot of pig populations. That being said, I mean, we have endemic and domestic diseases similar. I mean, PRRS, PEDV, things like that. But this is something a little different because it's considered I'm losing my train of thought here on the actual word, but it's in the same case of foot and mouth disease, FMD. So what that does is, as soon as you see these endemic diseases on any shore, exports go down very, very quickly. So that's why it's more important compared to our domestic diseases, at least from an export
So,
perspective.
Glenn, to your point, you think that we have an opportunity to export even more of our product because this stuff, we don't have ASF domestically. We've done an amazing job of keeping it out. And I mean, U.S. Department of Agriculture and pork producers in the United States have kept it away at bay. So you think we can pick up more? What happens when ASF goes away? Are we still going to be positioned to export more?
Yes, I think so. You know, the thing is, there's two sides to the export. There's quantity and value. The one thing that we really capitalize on the export market is we can export products that we don't necessarily consider to be consumable, or at least not a high value product in the U.S. And so I think there's some tremendous opportunities in that area. There's also some countries that we've not had access to that we're gaining access to through National Pork Board and USMEF, working with these trade organizations, trying to expand our markets and get pork. We feel we have the best producers in the world in the United States, and so we can produce a product economically for them, but there has to be a little profit margin, and we have to be able to sell it to those countries, not only just the volume, but the value as well.
All right, so you go ahead and set value. I was going to avoid this topic, but I have no choice now, Glenn. Here's what you do. You backed me into a corner. Pig rectums. Pig rectums. I spoke at the National Pork Producers Council about 4 or 5 years ago, let's say, and a U.S. Meat Export Federation presenter was up on stage and talked about, of all things, pig rectums. The average American consumer would gag and try and feed it to the alley cats, but they actually sell for about, I thought I heard, the same price as pork loin in many Asian countries. Help me out there. Is that still accurate?
Yeah, I'm going to expand that to the intestines. The intestines are, as you said, are considered an offal or a waste product. Offal is the product that goes to rendering or to cat food and pet food, whereas foreign countries will take those intestines and sanitize them very thoroughly and utilize them for casings for their sausages and hot dogs and that type of thing, where in the U.S., we would consider that non-edible and utilize synthetic casings. And so there's just an extreme demand, particularly in some of our Hispanic population, for chitterlings or intestines, as they're referred to. And so that's the thing that, rather than throwing it into the offal or the waste product, rendering product, it now has value to be consumed by the public.
Do pig rectums sell for more than pork loins in certain Asian countries? Can you at least go to that one? Because I found that to be fascinating. Adam's smiling. Adam must know.
You checked that spread this morning, Glenn?
I did not. I did not look at that this morning. You're more of an expert in that area than I am, Damian.
Talk about pig rectums. I'm your guy. Answer me this then. One of the things we talk about, Damian, and I got other questions then about the business model, especially in South Dakota, where I'm going to be. Again, I'm going to be up there in January. So if you're listening to this and you're saying, I've never been to a Pork Producers Council event, you should go to this one, because I'll make it worth your while, because I'm going to be on stage and I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff that's way more interesting than pig rectums. Expanding demand, creating demand. We hear this a lot. And I'm all about sales and I'm all about promotion. And God knows I'm a huge cheerleader of agriculture. The easiest way to create demand for your product is to make it good, right? And to expose it to more people that have not had it. So there's a couple of things when I hear about pork. Allegedly, there's like 1/3 of the population in the United States that is not a pork consumer. I remember hearing that at pork events where I was a speaker. Is that still right? like 1/3 of the population allegedly doesn't even eat pork, or maybe it's even more. I've heard that a number of times, but then they don't realize they're consuming pork when they have a pepperoni pizza. But anyway, do you know anything about this?
I'm not sure about the percentage or the accuracy of the percentage, but I do know there's certain cultures that, and we respect that. Some for religious reasons do not eat pork. Some folks for religious reasons. Pork has had a bad rap as far as preparation goes. The grandmother's way of processing pork or preparing pork and cooking it till it was overdone and gets the texture of shoe leather are gone. Today, we've not had trichina, which is a parasite that was transmittable from pigs to human, from pork to humans back in the early 1900s, 1800s. We've not had trichina forever, or not forever, but for ages in the pork industry. So some people still have the thought process that they have to cook pork to well done. Pork is now much more palatable at 145 degrees, which USDA has approved. 145 degrees for whole cut pork is the right temperature at a 3-minute rest. And so preparation is a big factor in improving product, as well as there's been trends in the society of moving from lean product to more tasteful product.
Hang on, before we get into the fat, I want to address the fat issue separately. I want you to know, in this book right here that I penned 3.5 years ago called Food Fear, about the past, present, future of ag and food production, I talked about that very topic as a lover of pork. And as a child of a mother who, from the Depression era, thought that pork needed to be cooked until you might as well just go ahead and set it aside and try and carve up the damn kitchen table and eat it, because that's what we haven't had trichinosis since the 1940s or 50s, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So anyway, you don't have to overcook your pork until it's like eating the table. So I love that topic right there, and I hope that we get that out. So then let's talk about the fat. Bacon. I mean, this thing's been on a 10-year tear. I think bacon prices roughly have, hell, they were the most expensive piece of pork you could get, and it proves the consumer does want flavorful pork, and they do want fat, right?
Correct. We just saw a huge demand in bacon when the fast food restaurants added bacon to their burgers and everything else to add that flavor factor, as well as the taste as well as the texture. And so bacon has been a driver of the industry and a supporter of the carcass value of a hog. So it's been a trendy change. It used to be considered too fat for the average consumer, and today they're willing to sacrifice that for flavor.
Yeah. Adam, what do you got? You're nodding your head. Bacon.
Just agreeing with Glenn there. No, it's interesting. I think pork is uniquely positioned compared to say our competitor, the cattle market, right? It takes 9 months for a cow to have a calf, and they have one calf a year. Pork can swing any direction it wants relatively quickly because the gestation period on a sow is 114 days, right? So we've seen super fat hogs back in, pick a time frame, I guess, when lard was just as important than
the 1950s. The golden era, I think it's the 1950s, although we had trichinosis. But yes, they had lard. Lard was still right now, manure is more valuable than in many cases. Back then, lard was a byproduct of pigs. They had a lot of fat on them.
Sure. So we go from that, raising pigs, to the 90s and the early 2000s when the lean meat and the lean pig was what the consumer wanted, but the consumer also wanted a good eating experience. Well, intermuscular fat and intramuscular fat marbling affects that eating experience. So now we're swinging the pendulum back the other day, and we're finding a more balanced place for the hog. I feel like a hog with a little more fat cover. Ideally, I think I talk with a few other people I cook with, but it's kind of frustrating sometimes. You go in the grocery store and try and find a whole pork loin, and it's almost like they shave too much fat off. I would much rather cook something with a little more fat on it and trim it when it's time to plate it.
My God, you're speaking my language. Mrs. Mason will buy a pork loin. Well, we used to buy half a hog, but now we don't have a half a hog. She'd buy a pork loin. I say, the problem is we got to marinate this with all kinds of oil to make it have the fat that I want. I want pork with fat on it. Speaking of pork with fat on it, so these new programs, registered, not certified Duroc or Berkshire, we hear these things. Those are breeds. And if you were in 4-H like me, you learned all your pig breeds from Chester Whites to Spottas to Poland Chinas to Hampshires to et cetera. The production model, massive production model, went to what do they call it? British whites, Yorkshire type white pigs that are very prolific and hold up well in an industrial pork production system. But we did sacrifice flavor. I think we can admit that. I mean, the consumer is telling us that, and in the markets, the foodies, the chefs are trying to get Berkshire and Duroc and things like this. Are we adjusting, Glenn, as the industry? You're from a Smithfield background. Are we going to see flavorful colored hogs coming back into the massive production system to where we bring back the flavor and the fat?
The factor that you didn't mention in there, Damian, is the fact that the commercial industry has gone to the maternal side. Those white breeds, the British white, like you're talking about, the Landrace and the Yorkshires have been able to raise more baby pigs and do better job of mothering than the colored breeds. So the colored breeds, or any breed that you mentioned, the Durocs, the Berkshires in particular, are more durable. They're going to have more fat. They're just a different conformation pig than what the maternal breeds are. So with the change of the industry and the emphasis on efficiencies, as you mentioned before, where there's premiums paid for the number of pigs born per litter, number of pigs weaned per litter, the white breeds have excelled in there. So that's been the issue right now. And if we can get to the point where the consumer is willing to pay a premium to offset the loss of production, we will change the pigs. As Adam just mentioned, we can do that in a hurry in the pork industry, because in 3 months you can change your old genetic package and your fertility program. And so it's very easy to change the trends in the pork industry.
Well, I would argue that too many of us in production agriculture think it's all about how cheap can we be, how cheap can we be, how cheap can we be. I believe that the consumer, now granted, we're in a second year of actual food inflation. Up until 2 years ago, we had been on a trend line of decreasing food prices as a percentage of income. So right now maybe isn't the time to do it, but I believe in the next few years, there will be an opportunity to say, you know what, we're just going to charge more and make a more flavorful product, or make it, we see the organic thing. I see obviously we're seeing it Duroc marketing. I think it's wrong to tie to a breed, in my opinion, because what if we have another breed that comes in that's even better at what the consumer wants? But I think that we are seeing some of that. So I would pay a premium, and I know that many consumers would. So I think that's still a thing where generally the big processing thinks it's all about how cheap can we be, but there's a big market segment that will pay more, as is evidenced by Whole Foods. Whole Foods has 4,000 in some stores. They're not doing that with 4 customers. Let's talk about then the thing that I haven't asked you about yet, the production. You're expanding, or you now leveled off in South Dakota. Pretty much it's going to be where the corn and the soybeans are. What about then competing uses for soybeans with renewable diesel? Is this something that, as an industry, do you go and say, hey, I don't know, man, now you're going to make soybeans more costly and it's going to hurt our hog production? Is this the kind of thing that you guys are on the forefront of, or does it matter?
Well, for us, we look at it as both sides of that. It will increase the value for the soybeans, but it'll also increase the volume of the soybean meal that Adam uses in his ration. So they're extracting the oil segment of the bean, and we will utilize the meal section, not byproduct, but the other side. You get 2 processes out of soybeans. It's not considered a byproduct. It's kind of like ethanol and DDGs, digestible protein.
Yeah.
So it's a plus for both the swine industry as well as the soybean industry with the biodiesel and bioenergy, because of the fact that we're going to have more meal available And hopefully, if they can make more profits on the oil side, that it can reduce the cost of the meal for the producers like Adam. So
if renewable diesel does expand, it actually ends up being a net gain for livestock production because there will be more meal through the crush, right? The oil goes to make fuel, and then the meal comes to, and the only way to use meal is to throw it through an animal. I mean, that's really the way it's most digestible, right? I mean, we can't eat soybean meal and do anything with it, really. It's got to go through a hog or a pig or a cow, right?
Right.
Chicken.
at this point,
Until you get to where you can eat it, but it may never come. Okay. I like the discussion. I still want a more flavorful pork with a lot more fat on it, but I might just have to put a flock out or a herd out here behind my barn and see if I can come up with it. What question did I not ask you that you need to address, Adam? You're a smart young man. What thing do you need to tell me?
Sure. So you're talking about flavor. Glenn alluded to, we're talking about exports with quantity versus quality. I think that all really plays into it, Damian. We talk about our exports. We talked about China an awful lot, but we left out two major export markets, one being Mexico. That's where the most volume, the most metric tons of our pork is exported to. But also we left out Japan, where we send significantly less tons, but that's the most dollars. That's the most value added product. They're taking the highest of the high end loins and taking them to Japan for a really great eating experience. It's amazing. They talk about the culture of the Japanese, and they'll spend 20 to 30 minutes in a window case picking out what pork loin they're gonna eat that night. I don't know if I've seen any American take more than 20 seconds at a meat counter. It's quite a different experience. So we talk about that. We talk about different cultures and different preferences, but we also have that not only within different countries, we have that within our own U.S. borders as well. You talk about, Damian, how you want a better meat eating experience. I think that's out there. Whether we got to coach you up a little bit and judge at the meat counter like some of those Japanese do, or we find those breeds or those certain producers that maybe are not necessarily producing a pork commodity like myself, but maybe more of a niche market. Yeah. Maybe that's how some of those independent producers that are still having 50 sows a year are able to make it, because they're not producing a commodity anymore. They're producing a niche market, and that's something.
I've always argued that there's an absolute, more than ever, there's a market for that, because A, we've got an affluent consumer still out here. B, we've got a foodie consumer. I talked about it in my book. 51% of Americans consider themselves to be foodies, means they have a passion and an interest and a love for a variety of food and food flavor. And the other part of it is the whole internet thing and the COVID thing made buying food online more acceptable than it ever had been before that. So, I mean, I've always said, you can sell a Scottish Highland that's blessed by a rabbi and petted by your daughter and name it Clarence better than you ever could have. So, I mean, the same thing for pork in that regard. Incidentally, you spoke about markets within the United States, and this is, we're wrapping up here, but this is a very important topic. You talk about Mexico. Mexico is now our number 2. They tied with Canada to be our number 2 agricultural customer. I believe there is growth potential as Mexico's economy has ascended greatly over the last 20 years. And you see the same thing, because they're your number 1 pork buyer, correct?
You broke up a little there. Did you say Mexico or Canada or both?
Isn't Mexico our number 1 pork purchasing country?
I believe so. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then I want to get to Proposition 12. We talked about expanding markets within the United States. How the hell do you do that when California puts more and more restrictions on how pigs are grown and the pen sizes they have to be in? So therefore, it becomes almost a de facto national. So is Proposition 12 produced by California, which means pigs have to have a certain pig space, and all of a sudden it's going to make production even harder? Is that going to impact the people of South Dakota that grow pigs? Glenn?
Well, it's very disappointing that the Supreme Court did not step in and set aside the fact that this violates interstate commerce. And for states to establish regulations, as you stated, is very disappointing. But you talk about versatility of our industry and the ability to adapt. We've got producers that have spent millions of dollars changing their production systems just so they can meet California standards. And The troubling part of that is what's the next standard they're going to put in and how much money are we going to have to spend to keep up with that, or what other states? We also have question 3 in Massachusetts. And so this is very concerning when you got state by state production practices being implemented by politicians or the general public that has no understanding of the scientific value or the scientific back research that's been done to back how we produce our hogs. It's kind of like we have our hogs currently in barns that are enclosed, and we haven't talked about biosecurity, which is protection for our pigs, but it's been a huge factor in maintaining and keeping African swine fever out of the United States, because our producers follow very strict protocols as to what gets into their barn as far as materials they use, feed products, how it gets there so it doesn't get contaminated, as well as the people flow coming in and out of their barns. And that's why we can't allow people in. But our producers are willing to adapt, but we need to make sure that we don't have a runaway of different regulations coming that have no basis for any scientific background to make these decisions.
Yeah, the tough part is that that's already happened. I mean, we don't need it, but it's already happened. California is Proposition 12 dictating how you can produce pigs. In South Dakota, if they're to be sold in California, it's been held up by the Supreme Court. And like you said, it's okay, you'll make the adjustment. Your producers will change their pen size and reconfigure their barns, spend millions of dollars in many cases. And then if 5 years later, the Humane Society of the United States goes and gets another initiative on the ballot in California, then do you do it again? Or do you finally just say no? You just say, no, California, you can just go without pork.
Yeah, currently California produces about 4% of the pigs in the United States, or 4% of the pork product. They consume about 15%. So they, on the other hand, are dependent on imports into their state. When we talk about imports and exports, it's not just foreign countries. This is going to be a state-by-state basis if this continues to build momentum.
I'm all for it. That's a battle for another time and a discussion for another podcast. But anyway, we've heard about South Dakota pork. We've heard about pork. We've heard about fat, flavor, exports, money, contract production, arguments against contract production, manure, the value of manure management, how a young guy can go back to the farm, like Adam's case, and because of this pork model. And more importantly, we're talking about the fact that I'm going to be joining these guys. I'm glad that Glenn and I started getting along. I'd say before we hit the record button, he was really surly. He was very difficult to get along with, but being very jovial and congenial like I am, I patch things along. Anyway, his name's Glenn Muller, the executive director of the South Dakota Pork Producers Council. Adam Krause is a farmer, a grain farmer, and a hog producer, and he's a South Dakota Pork Producers Council president. I'm going to be there on January 11th. I'm going to be the morning slot in Sioux Falls speaking to their organization, and I wanted them to come on here and talk to you guys about pork. Honestly, thanks a lot, guys. Good educational stuff. Maybe we'll come back in a year or two and discuss this whole proposition state by state, telling you how you can raise pigs and chickens. Are you interested in that?
Sure.
Got it.
Excellent.
His name's Adam. His name's Glenn. Thanks for being here. Until next time, I'm Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of The Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern Ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.